Good evening, everyone. We are absolutely excited to see you here and to see this wonderful turnout. It's our great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 6th Walter Benjamin Lectures here at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. This event, as most of you know, is truly the highlight of our academic year for us. My name is Rahel Jaeggi, and together with Robin Celikates, I'm the director of the Center for Social Critique. Since 2019 now, the Benjamin Lectures bring a leading thinker of our time to Berlin to give a series of 3 lectures exploring key challenges of our time. The lectures are named after the Berlin-born philosopher Walter Benjamin. They are not dedicated, though, to discussing Benjamin's own work, but inspired by his intellectual integrity and political commitment in the face of catastrophe. Spanning 3 consecutive evenings, the format of the lectures opens up the space for developing a philosophical line of argument in complex yet accessible ways. Apropos accessible, falls Sie noch einen Kopfhörer benötigen für die Simultanübersetzung ins Deutsche, die es gibt, dann finden Sie den Stand mit den Kopfhörern draußen vor dem Eingang. Also alle diejenigen, die sich wohler dabei fühlen, der deutschen Übersetzung zu folgen, die seien herzlich eingeladen, sich einen solchen Kopfhörer zu besorgen.
Yeah, a warm welcome from me as well. It's really good to be back here at the iconic HKW, at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and to see such a large crowd. Thanks so much to Bonaventure and Li Kung and the whole team of the HKW for their hospitality and support in organizing these lectures and holding them in this wonderful space here. We are really looking forward to 3 evenings of learning about and discussing the political ethics of the oppressed and how protest, self-respect, solidarity, and the role of intellectuals in struggles against oppression and injustice are all hanging together.
So one of the undisputed cornerstones of critical theory is Marx's categorical imperative from 1844 to overthrow all conditions in which the human being is a debased, enslaved, neglected, despicable being. The emphasis here is on all conditions. From time to time, there are family disputes within critical theory whether or not critical theorists really live up to the demanding task to focus on all forms of oppression. It now seems obvious that feminist and anti-racist struggles should have played much more central roles in the development of critical social theory. I will not go into the details of these debates, but it is clear to us that an adequate analysis and critique of capitalism has to include an understanding of the role that racism and colonialism, as well as gender-based domination, played in the formation of the capitalist mode of production, and still play to this very day. Maybe, in addition to Max Horkheimer's famous dictum that whoever is not willing to speak about capitalism should also keep quiet about fascism, we should also say whoever is not willing to speak about racism should also keep quiet about capitalism. As some of you will remember, the exact nature of the relation between capitalism and racism has also been at the center of the Benjamin Lectures delivered by Nancy Fraser and Sally Hesslinger in recent years. And those of you who didn't have the chance to be present at the time can find video recordings of these lectures, including also Lea Üppi's lectures from last year, on our website.
So this is where we are coming from, and given that these are the discussions we were interested in over the last years, we are extremely excited and honored to welcome this year's Benjamin Chair, Tommie Shelby, whom we have tried to bring to Berlin actually for quite a few years now, and we're very happy that we finally succeeded in doing so. Tommie's work brings together the conceptual clarity of analytic philosophy with the social theoretical grounding and the political commitment to emancipation that are characteristic of both Marxism and the Black radical tradition that he brings together in a novel and theoretically and politically really rich framework that he calls Afro-analytical Marxism. Tommie Shelby is Lee Simpkins Family Professor of Arts and Sciences and the Caldwell Titcomb Professor in the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. Wow, that's quite a title. And I had to really look at every single word to give you the full title. But more importantly, maybe even he's a leading voice and one of the most original thinkers in contemporary political and social philosophy and the critical philosophy of race. Among his many publications, there are 3 books that are highly influential and very much discussed, namely We Who Are Dark, The Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity from 2005, Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform from 2016, and most recently, The Idea of Prison Abolition from 2022. And if you haven't read those books, we really highly recommend you do so.
So in a recent discussion, and actually we had quite some discussions already with him, Tommie referred to himself as a liberal, moralist, black radical Marxist. Liberal, moralist, black radical Marxist, who is not only interested in exploring how capitalist exploitation and racist oppression go hand in hand, but also in what ethical and political implications follow from this analysis for the exploited and the oppressed. How can they live their lives with dignity and self-respect? And how can they resist and overthrow the conditions under which they are debased, enslaved, and neglected? I'm sure you can see why we are so happy when Tommie accepted our invitation to come to Berlin for 2 months as the Benjamin Chair, and why we are now so excited to be in conversation with him about the political ethics of the oppressed and the prospects of liberation. Tommie, it's truly wonderful to have you here in Berlin. Thank you so much for making this possible. We really enjoyed having you here already, and we are looking forward to the lectures a lot.
Just a few more words on the kind of topic and the theme that brings us together. So as Rahel said, the topic of the lectures is the political ethics of the oppressed, members of oppressed groups in this perspective, so groups who are systematically disadvantaged and treated in demeaning, dehumanizing, and structurally unfair ways are confronted with a whole range of ethically pressing challenges that have not exactly been at the center of mainstream philosophical theorizing, although they have been central to the black radical tradition. Questions such as how can we not only survive, but live a life that allows for self-respect under these conditions of oppression? What do we owe to each other as members of oppressed groups, but also to others whose fate might be even worse? What risks and personal costs does the obligation to fight oppression entail? And what do we do, or what do I do, when the demands of solidarity come into conflict with my own self-realization or personal relations or intellectual pursuits that I value as well? These questions remain pressing today, despite and also because of the changing circumstances in a time marked by the resurgence of white supremacy, police violence, attacks on migrant and racialized communities, both in the US but also here in Europe and in Germany, and the rise of authoritarian and even fascist tendencies. In his lectures, Tommie will discuss the challenges these questions give rise to, especially in a situation in which an end to racism, let alone an end to all those conditions in which the human being is debased, enslaved, and neglected that Marx has pointed to, is not in sight. Overcoming these conditions of oppression requires persistence and defiance, and a perspective that allows for the dignity and self-realization of the oppressed in the here and now, in the face of and despite ongoing oppression and injustice. It's maybe in the spirit of Walter Benjamin that there's also an insistence here that the joys of liberation cannot be merely a promise for future generations, but they have to have some resonance in the present.
So tonight, Tommie Shelby will start us off by introducing the idea of a political ethics of the oppressed and explore the role of solidarity in this context. He will speak for about an hour, and after the lecture, you will have the opportunity to ask questions.
There are a few words of thanks that are crucial and that we do want to speak before we hand it over to Tommie and finally hear him speak. In addition to the New Institute Foundation, which generously funds our center and its activities, this is the first year of what we hope will be a wonderful cooperation with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, whose substantial contribution helped to make this year's Benjamin Lectures possible. We're very grateful. We are very grateful to Johanna Bussemer, Franziska Albrecht, and Henning Obens in particular for the generous support. The Benjamin Lectures aim at a larger public, and we thank the translators Felix Kurz and Max Henninger, who we're sure will do again a great job in providing a simultaneous translation of the lectures into German. And we would like to thank Surkamp, the publishing house that has established a series in which the Benjamin Lectures appear. Thanks also again to our hosts, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, for their hospitality and for making it possible for us to be in this wonderful auditorium, and in particular, again, to Bonaventure Ndikung, to Leila Dillik, and Sebastian Sprenger, and the whole technical team, who are, as always, a great help and support. Finally, we would like to thank Daniela Burger for creating the fabulous poster and all the visuals, and of course, the fantastic team of the Center for Social Critique, and especially Sveta Pauli for all their work over the last weeks and months, without which we simply wouldn't be here tonight. Most of all, however, we thank our speaker for the next 3 evenings, for accepting our invitation, spending so much time with us and discussing. Please join me in welcoming Tommie Shelby.
Good evening, everyone. First, thank you to Rahel and to Robin. What a wonderful, warm introduction. I really appreciate that. And I certainly want to thank you both for the invitation to give the Benjamin Lectures and for your really tremendous hospitality. Since I've been in Berlin, I've had a great time, and you've been very welcoming in that respect. Very honored to be here. I also want to express my gratitude to the staff at the Center for Social Critique, particularly to Sveta Pauli and Christian Schmidt and Friedemann Melcher. Been incredible host, often really going way beyond the call of duty and ensuring my easy transition here and taking care of any and all needs since I've been here. And I'd like to thank the participants in the Center's lunch colloquium for your thoughtful, critical feedback on my lectures. It's really invaluable to get your responses to my earlier drafts of these lectures. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening, and I look forward to our conversation together. So, what does it mean to live well? That's obviously a classic philosophical question, and I'm going to divide it into 2 parts. The first concerns the conduct, the dispositions, the attitudes that morality requires. It's about duty, it's about permissibility, it's about character, and so on. Then there's a second part about the basic components of a fulfilling life, about what we need to truly thrive. So while a life well lived surely includes meeting our various moral obligations, it's not limited to that, but extends to personal flourishing. So within the field of philosophy, these sorts of questions, they typically are taken up in the subdiscipline of ethics. Philosophers also try to understand what constitutes a just or good society, identifying the values and the principles that we should use when evaluating various political structures. We ask what kinds of social arrangements are legitimate and so merit our allegiance and our respect. These sorts of questions fall within the subfield of political philosophy. So these lectures are going to take up some questions where ethics and political philosophy intersect, or what is sometimes called political ethics. Now, I'm not mainly concerned with how we should live in a fully just society or world. So my primary interest is what is sometimes called non-ideal theory. And here we focus on addressing ethical questions, but we do so within the context of societal injustices. Often traditional philosophical approaches to ethics abstract away from the historical or ongoing injustices that so profoundly shape our lives together. Benign ideal theory attempts to confront these grim realities directly. Over the next 3 evenings, I will explore some ethical challenges that are faced by those who endure oppression. I'll also examine some ways such persons might seek to find some purpose, some sense of meaning in their lives amidst injustice. It's common for persons in these situations to pursue material comforts, to seek love and friendship, to express themselves through art, religion. They also often strive to achieve personal aspirations, despite the various unjust barriers that are set in their path. But a crucial aspect of living well, particularly for the oppressed, is maintaining one's dignity, both in ordinary living and also as one faces death. This entails living in such a manner that one can hold one's head high, living without shame, despite confronting conditions that can tempt one to do otherwise. In essence, the question I want to ask might be put this way: what constitutes a morally responsible and dignified response from the oppressed when confronted with enduring injustice? So the answer to this question is what I term the political ethics of the oppressed. Now, this is a somewhat unusual question for a philosopher to take up, as is my approach to answering it. So let me take a few minutes to explain a bit more how I understand the question and say a little bit about how I'm going to tackle it. So I've spent my adult life studying European and Anglo-American moral and political philosophy. I've learned an enormous amount from these traditions, yet I've also made a point to study moral and political thought in the Black intellectual tradition, particularly its more radical strands. The Black intellectual tradition often draws upon European and Anglo-American philosophy, but it also goes beyond these, or maybe it takes them in uncommon directions. Much of modern Black political thought is properly understood, I think, as a part of Western political philosophy. However, often when people approach the history of Black political thought, they tend to interpret it as essentially a series of debates about strategy. So the question here, so it seems to them, is about what will or what won't work to bring about the group's liberation. Now, there is some value in this way of reading the Black tradition, yet I do think it is limited and it misrepresents the best of Black thought. The Black political tradition is as much about ends as it is about means. Thinkers such as Frederick Douglass or W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr. have reflected on what fundamentally we should be trying to achieve. They're asking, as philosophers from Plato to Rawls have, what is justice, not merely how we might achieve it. They're trying to understand what true freedom consists in and what equality demands. They're attempting to come to terms with the meaning of democracy. They want to know what's its content, its scope, and foundation. The disagreements among Black thinkers on these fundamental questions are just as profound as they are on issues of strategy and tactics. That said, I've come to think that the Black political tradition's most significant contributions to political philosophy are to our understanding of the political ethics of the oppressed, attempting to grasp what it might mean to live well and with dignity under conditions of grave injustice is really its central preoccupation. Now, Black political thought is diverse. The strand of Black political thought I'm going to draw on in these lectures is the Black radical tradition. This is a tradition greatly influenced by socialist thought, particularly by Marxism. It retains a critical focus on imperialism, on class, on market society. However, Black radicals are just as concerned to combat racial domination as they are to resist capitalism. When Black radicalism confronts imperialism, it centers colonialism and the racial ideology that rationalizes it. It sees the race-class nexus as profound and complex, with neither racism nor class exploitation as more urgent or more fundamental than the other. and then attempts to understand that nasty mix of bourgeois culture and white supremacy, which has often led to fascism. Now, the deepest and most wide-ranging thinker in the Black radical tradition is W.E.B. Du Bois. He clearly sets the standard, which is formidably high. And, I might add, he was a graduate student in sociology at the University of Berlin. Du Bois will make a few appearances in these lectures, particularly tomorrow evening. Yet I want to turn our attention mostly to another, less familiar figure in the Black radical tradition, Richard Wright. Wright, an American writer, was a man of ideas. He especially loved philosophical and psychological theories, and his writing reflected this preoccupation with such ideas. Politically speaking, Wright was a left-wing radical. He was, for a time, a member of the Communist Party. He was a persistent and sharp critic of American racism and capitalism. And as an expatriate in France after the Second World War, he was intensely engaged with debates on the European left. Like Du Bois, Richard Wright was prolific, and he expressed himself in multiple genres of writing. He's best known for his two best-selling books, the 1940 novel Native Son and his 1945 memoir, Black Boy. Wright wrote several other novels, notably The Outsider and The Long Dream. He authored several short stories and penned poetry and drama, but he also wrote about as much nonfiction as he did fiction and poetry, often taking a global perspective when he does so. For instance, he wrote two books of travel writing, Pagan Spain, about fascism and Franco Spain, and Black Power, about the early days of decolonization in Nkrumah's Ghana. He was deeply interested in anti-colonial movements for national liberation in Africa and Asia, and provided insightful, if highly controversial, commentary on these in books such as White Man Listen and The Color Curtain. And in 12 Million Black Voices, he wrote a remarkable philosophical history of African Americans in poetic prose. Now, most works within the Black radical tradition, and indeed much of the broader Black political tradition, they don't conform to the structure of a formal theoretical treatise, like, say, Leviathan or Das Kapital or A Theory of Justice. To engage seriously with this tradition and to appreciate its contributions to political ethics, you have to be willing to turn to a range of literary genres, to fiction, to autobiography, literary nonfiction, drama, poetry, and historical narrative. This turn to diverse genres is not a departure from the norms of academic philosophy, at least not as I understand them. In fact, the Western philosophical canon itself is rich with works that transcend the boundaries of traditional treatise writing. Philosophers have long engaged with, of course, Plato's and Hume's dialogues, Augustine's and Rousseau's confessional autobiographies, Nietzsche's philosophical fiction and poetic fragments, and Sartre's plays and novels. So in that spirit, I will approach Richard Wright's work as a rich, multi-genre contribution to moral and political philosophy. So I've explained what I mean by the political ethics of the oppressed. Yet I've said little about the idea of oppression or who the oppressed are. The oppressed, put it somewhat loosely, are those who suffer the most in an unjust social order. Though many are negatively affected by unjust systems, the oppressed are the ones most directly impacted. They carry the heaviest burdens, and typically do so over long periods of time, sometimes over generations. But rather than defend the sort of abstract conception of oppression or try to offer you a theory of injustice, which I cannot do, let me use Wright's life and his writings to give a more concrete sense of what I have in mind by the term oppression. So Wright was born and raised in the Jim Crow South of the United States. At the age of 19, he joined the Great Migration, moving from Chicago and then 10 years later to New York City. Much of his work gives vivid and arresting portraits of both the Southern segregation regime and the ghettoization of Black migrants in the industrializing cities in the North. He captured the horror of lynching and police brutality, and he analyzed their function in maintaining Black subordination. He tells us after slavery was abolished in the United States, most Black Americans remained in the Southern states where they were subject to constant racial discrimination, formal segregation, and a race-based status hierarchy. This social system, sometimes called Jim Crow, greatly attenuated Black people's civil rights, and it limited the vast majority to menial labor. Black people couldn't realistically aspire to high-status occupations or positions of authority. Even the ambition to do so was ridiculed, discouraged, and often resented. The reigning social norms required subservience and deference with good cheer. Black individuals and the communities who openly rebelled against the system of Jim Crow were vulnerable to violent, often murderous, reprisals. The most frightening and lethal penalty for defying Jim Crow norms was lynching, a form of mob violence often involving torture and mutilation that executes a presumed offender without trial. Lynching was the informal enforcement mechanism for the Jim Crow system. It terrorized Black communities throughout the South, often forcing them into either submission or flight. Wright depicted and analyzed the practice of lynching in much of his fiction and nonfiction writings. For example, lynching is vividly represented in his early short story, Big Boy Leaves Home. In the story, which is based on real-life events, 4 Black boys are violently attacked by a white man for allegedly violating a Jim Crow prohibition. The two of the boys are shot and killed at the scene of the incident. The protagonist, Big Boy, kills their attacker in self-defense. He and the remaining boy flee the scene of violent confrontation. Expecting swift retaliation, the Black community rallies to save the boys' lives by attempting to quickly and quietly send them to the urban North. But only Big Boy manages to escape. The other boy is caught, tortured, and killed by a white mob, a chilling spectacle that Big Boy actually observes, of course, in horror. Wright was personally affected by lynching as well. When he was 8 years old, Wright, his mother, and brother lived for a short time in Arkansas with Wright's Aunt Maggie and Uncle Hoskins. Mr. Hoskins owned a thriving bar that catered to a Black clientele, but he was shot and killed by white men who were jealous of his successful liquor business and who had demanded many times that he leave town or face the consequences. Out of shock and fear, Wright's family, including Aunt Maggie, suddenly fled the town without burying Mr. Hoskins or claiming any of his assets. As Wright remarks, Uncle Hoskins has simply been plucked from our midst, and we, figuratively, had fallen on our faces to avoid looking into that white, hot face of terror that we knew loomed somewhere above us. When Wright was 15, he learned that a classmate's brother had been taken out on a country road by a group of white men and shot to death. His crime, he, a Black man, had enjoyed the services of a white female prostitute. Wright's reflections on this event provide, I think, a sort of window onto the pervasive psychological impact of Jim Crow terrorism. He says, "What I had heard altered the look of the world, induced in me a temporary paralysis of will and impulse. The penalty of death awaited me if I made a false move, and I wondered if it was worthwhile to make any move at all. The things that influenced my conduct as a Negro did not have to happen to me directly. I needed but to hear of them to feel their full effects in the deepest layers of my consciousness." This ever-present threat of violence was, of course, not mere labor discipline. Its aim was to maintain a strict system of racial hierarchy, one that cut across class lines. It required complete deference of black people to white people's preferences, and not simply obedience to one's employer. Saying that such racially motivated violence divides the working class and so inhibits interracial labor solidarity, while no doubt true, doesn't really do justice to the problem of lynching. The Great Migration, here after World War I, of black people from the South to the North had a range of causes. There was, of course, a desire to escape white violence in the South. There was the dramatic drop in the demand for agricultural laborers in the South, due in part to the mechanization of agriculture. There was increasing demand for low-skilled labor in the North. And the black press characterized the North as a land of promise. But the black migrants faced many obstacles in their new environment. With limited skills, they were restricted to manual labor and domestic work, with no possibility for advancement. Vocational and professional schools, they refused to train black people in the higher trades. White workers wouldn't allow blacks to join their unions, and they wanted to keep the best work for themselves. Yet they hated black workers for being strikebreakers and for lowering white wages. In addition to being paid low wages, black workers were forced to do the heaviest, do the dirtiest, and the most dangerous work. This conflict between white and black workers was, of course, to the advantage of their employers, and they encouraged and exploited the antagonism. Moreover, white people refused to live amongst black people, creating residential segregation in urban ghettos. Bankers and real estate owners instigated and profited from white racism in the housing market. Wright used the urban kitchenette to explain the housing situation of new black migrants to northern cities. What's the kitchenette? A kitchenette was a one-room apartment with a small gas stove and a single sink. Kitchenettes were created by carving up a larger apartment that had been previously inhabited by white families. Those living in a kitchenette shared a bathroom with several other residents. Because of overcrowding, the kitchenette bred and fostered disease. It invited crime. It destroyed families. This concentration of the disadvantaged and the discontent caused ceaseless conflict and violence. These overpriced apartments were, in Wright's words, our prison, our death sentence without trial, the new form of mob violence that assaults not only the lone individual, but all of us in its ceaseless attacks. The kitchenette, described with really incredible verve and lyricism in 12 Million Black Voices, also serves as a kind of metaphor for racial oppression. Indeed, Wright opens his famous novel, Native Son, set in Chicago, with a scene in a cramped kitchenette, where Bigger Thomas, the main protagonist, kills a defiant, huge black rat. And his mother prophesies that Bigger will meet his fate at the gallows. As foreshadowed in this scene, the novel ends with Bigger in jail awaiting his execution. In America, the kitchenette and the jail cell serve essentially the same function. They are instruments of domination and repression used to isolate and contain a subjugated low-status group, and often to torture and kill its expendable members. Now, I've summarized Wright's account of the black condition in the United States to give a concrete sense of the black radical perspective on group-based oppression, particularly at the intersection of race and class. Now, Wright died in 1960. And the social world he described is, of course, much different today. Jim Crow, as a formal system of subjugation has been abolished. Black people are much more integrated into mainstream American society, but urban ghettos persist. The racial status hierarchy has not been fully dismantled, to say the least, and a white nationalist movement is on the rise. So, the political ethics of the oppressed that I'm going to try to reconstruct from Wright's work while of course most suited, I think, for Black Americans prior to the Civil Rights Movement, is, I believe, still pertinent today. So let me turn now to the substance of the political ethics of the oppressed. Now, I think any such ethic is going to have solidarity at its center. Solidarity is essential because without it, genuine freedom cannot be secured. The powerful and privileged stubbornly seek to hold on to their advantages and are willing to fight, often using violence and lies to keep these advantages. So sustained, concerted action among a critical mass of people is required to bring about structural transformation. Cooperation rooted purely in just overlapping interests can't really survive the adversity or overcome the collective action problems that are going to inevitably arise. Yet there are competing ways of thinking about solidarity and its relationship to oppressed groups. And so to lay a bit of the groundwork for the lectures to come, I'm going to offer a general conception of solidarity drawn from the Black radical tradition. So here I'm going to focus on what it means for a group to have solidarity rather than what it means for an individual to act in solidarity. Some will say that I stand in solidarity with the people of X, though they may have no real connection to the people of X. Now, I am not criticizing this usage or actions taken in this spirit. What I'm trying to do is better understand solidarity as an attribute of a group and a basis for enduring cooperation and collective action. Solidarity, so understood, I think, is principally an ethical ideal, a shared set of practical principles. Specifically, I characterize solidarity as a complex joint and reciprocal commitment. This abiding commitment is initiated by a pledge or a vow, whether explicit or implied. So the pledge here is acting as a way of sincerely binding oneself to others who have made or at least are willing to make a similar commitment. So having bound oneself through this vow, others in the group may rightly hold one accountable for perceived failures to live up to the pledge. Solidarity is sometimes characterized as a type of feeling or a sentiment comparable to affection, the affection one might have for, say, a family member or a friend. Now, again, I'm not disputing this usage, there's nothing wrong with it, yet I want to distinguish feelings of solidarity from the commitment of solidarity. The commitment can be, and often is, of course, prompted by feelings of affection for members of the group. It can, of course, also be fitting to develop such sentiments as one keeps to the commitment and as one receives the benefits from others' reciprocal commitment. Yet the feeling of solidarity is a spontaneous reaction. It's not really an act of will. The commitment of solidarity can be undertaken for practical reasons, and, if it's to be binding, cannot really be involuntary. Also, one can have the feelings without undertaking or honoring the commitment. Feelings of affinity can certainly create greater cohesion within the group. Such sentiments can move one to sacrifice or take courage whenever this is called for, but it is the ethical commitment of solidarity that I'm going to focus on here, as I regard it as a kind of ethical ideal. So what does this commitment involve? So I'm going to draw our attention to 5 core features of this joint and reciprocal commitment. So first, there's what I'm calling mutual identification. This is a commitment to treat one another as a collective group. Members identify with the group as a unified whole. When it comes to the group's well-being or goals, each member is committed to thinking in terms of we, rather than in terms of I. Fellow members are treated as an extension of the self. Group members might identify with one another for, of course, a variety of reasons. Could be because they share an ethnic heritage or nationality, but it might also be because members believe themselves to share a similar plight. Or they might identify with one another because they share a set of ideals that they hope to realize. A second feature of solidarity is special concern. So this is a commitment to assist and protect those with whom one identifies. This kind of concern is not a matter of meeting one's, say, general moral obligations to help anybody in need. Rather, it's particularistic. It's a form of partiality, a distinctive mode of concern limited to those within the group. Now, it's perfectly compatible with a strong sense of moral responsibility to those outside the group, I think. Others get the moral treatment they are owed, yet group members get more than what morality between strangers strictly demands. There's a third aspect of solidarity, and that is common values and goals. Members of the group are committed to a set of values or objectives. Each believes that fellow members know what these values are, know what these goals are, and that fellow members accept them. These values or goals might be vague ideals like freedom, right? Or they might be very specific practical principles like ending school segregation. They might include utopian social visions like abolishing the police and prisons. The group here is constituted, at least in part, by its shared values or ends, which comprise the central aspect of its distinctive self-conception. The fourth component of solidarity is loyalty. Group members stick by and stand up for one another when faced with adversity. They refrain from actions that would threaten the group's fundamental aims. Group loyalty is generally defined in opposition to some other group or groups. So in this case, there's a kind of in-group and an out-group. Groups with a commitment of solidarity show loyalty to in-group members as opposed to those in the relevant out-group, whose interests, goals, or values will generally differ from or conflict with those in the in-group. So in this case, the traitor, or the sellout, as we might say, is the person who not only lacks fidelity to the group's values or goals, but who betrays the group, possibly for personal gain, to its relevant out-group. The fifth and final element of solidarity I'd like to mention is mutual trust. So members must trust one another to some significant degree, for such trust really is the basis for meaningful cooperation and collective action over time. Each must act on the assumption that others are doing, or will do, their part to abide by the group's values and to advance its goals. Now, all kinds of groups can have solidarity in this sense. Among the most familiar, of course, are kinship groups, nations, workers in a union, ethnic groups, people of a particular religious faith, and political parties. Police officers and military personnel, street gangs, and organized crime syndicates can also share solidarity, I think. Though political solidarity will be the focus here, not all groups that have solidarity share specifically political values or goals. Now, I don't think that solidarity is always good. Whether group solidarity is a virtue will depend on at least two things. Are its specific values and goals defensible or worthwhile? A white supremacist movement might have solidarity, but this will be something, of course, to lament and to defeat. There's also the question of how the lines of solidarity are drawn. If they are drawn too narrowly or too broadly, excluding people who shouldn't be, who should be included, or including people who shouldn't, this might be an objectionable thing, even if the values or goals that the group are committed to or happen to be legitimate. So, to summarize, group solidarity is a joint and reciprocal ethical commitment of a set of individuals. This commitment is to identify with each other, to act with special concern for one another, to embrace the group's values and goals, to be loyal to the group and its values or goals, and to trust one another. While many types of groups exhibit solidarity and thus the 5 features I've here highlighted, there are 2 types of solidarity groups that differ from one another in ways that are relevant to the political ethics of the oppressed. The first is a group committed to advancing a political cause, for instance, anti-racism or socialism, or collective self-determination. The second type of group is an oppressed group, facing systemic and enduring injustice. An oppressed group is often, though not always, a species of the first kind of solidarity group. That is, the members of an oppressed group, or at least a critical mass thereof, can be committed to a political cause, such as its own liberation. But many groups committed to a political cause will have members who are not themselves oppressed, or from the relevant oppressed group. For example, when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was founded in 1909, its co-founder, Du Bois, was the only black member of its board of directors. All the others were white. So those committed to a political cause will often form an advocacy organization or a political party. Political organization brings discipline to more informal forms of political solidarity. It enables effective cooperation, planning, strategic action. Political organization allows groups to formulate determinate political agenda, sometimes structured around a particular political ideology. Members will often share decision-making power within the formally organized association, or at least there'll be some kind of rules, established rules for making binding decisions. The rights and responsibilities of members in good standing, these are often sort of codified and mutually understood. And members can be expelled for shirking their responsibilities or for failing to follow the organization's rules. Participants in a social movement can also have political solidarity. A social movement can be made up of several political parties and advocacy organizations, but it will often have many participants who are not formally affiliated with an associated organization. So here we might think of the civil rights movement that contains many organizations, but also lots of people who were not active or even members at all of some of those organizations. Social movements are generally animated by a cause, which the participants can interpret in a wide variety of ways. There can be great ideological diversity among participants or organizations within a social movement. Since a social movement is not an organization, it can't make policies, right? It can't negotiate with those in power. It can't take up formal political actions in that sense. But political organizations often garner strength, and of course, sometimes members, from social movements that they participate in. So to help us think about solidarity among members of an oppressed group, I'm going to focus on the plight of black people confronting race-based subordination and on the predicament of the working class people facing economic exploitation. So these two disadvantaged groups are distinct, but not, of course, mutually exclusive. And the black radical tradition concerns itself with both groups, especially the relations between them. Now, many on the political left maintain that members of some oppressed groups, for example, black Americans, are preoccupied with affirming their distinctive social identity and generally neglect broader universalist or egalitarian concerns. Now, maybe there's some truth to this charge. But black Americans are a historically oppressed group and can legitimately commit to solidarity on that basis, just like the working class is an oppressed group under capitalism and may commit to solidarity on that ground. Both groups share interests that are often threatened and worth defending through organized collective action. So I'm distinguishing between the solidarity created by a shared subordinate condition and the kind of solidarity that might be shared among members of a political party or a broad social movement. The latter organize solely around sharing a specific set of ideals that they seek to realize collectively. And again, those committed to the cause need not be from the relevant oppressed group. Though the members of an oppressed group can cultivate and embrace solidarity, they rarely have the kind of political cohesiveness that, say, a political party or a social movement has. While black people, for instance, share a sense of solidarity and therefore some common values, we disagree, sometimes rather sharply, on the precise causes of our disadvantage, on the best strategy to improve our situation, on what it would mean for us to truly be free. We don't have an agreed upon political agenda or a shared ideology. Nevertheless, I reject the idea that the solidarity that exists between black people isn't, or at least couldn't be, in a meaningful sense, political. This solidarity is not simply a network of mutual support or an affinity group that happens to share cultural heritage. I'd say is common, for instance, among immigrant communities. Black solidarity is structured in part around confronting unjust power. It's a time-honored vehicle for collective resistance against white supremacy. And, as I'm going to try to explain, this solidarity is governed by robust political ethics. The duty to resist and correct injustice belongs to everyone, of course. Black people don't have a greater duty than those who aren't black. There are many injustices in our world, and nobody can meaningfully, productively contribute to correcting them all. Each of us naturally has some discretion about which justice causes we're going to take up. But if resisting racial subjugation is one of my chosen causes, then I should, of course, select effective means to that end. And if black solidarity would help, I take it that's a pretty strong reason to embrace it. If such solidarity is necessary for the success of the cause, then that, I think, should be decisive. I embrace black solidarity. If you're complicit in injustice, that naturally gives you a strong moral reason to correct it. I also think members of an oppressed group should resist their oppression on grounds of self-respect. It is, I believe, undignified to silently submit to mistreatment, and more on that topic in my third lecture. But those who are neither complicit in injustice nor directly affected by it still, of course, have a reason to combat it, assuming they have the opportunity. Again, black people don't have more responsibility to correct injustice against black people than white people or others have. Black people do, however, have distinctive practical reasons to support one another and to fight together for better social conditions. For instance, as Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton emphasized in their influential 1967 book, Black Power, ethno-racial politics in the United States are a reality that black people must take seriously, and they have to plan accordingly. Maintaining black solidarity is a wise form of collective self-defense in a context of competing loyalties and group-based conflicts of interest. It's, at a minimum, a last line of defense in case wider coalitions break down. Also, black people have inherited a beautiful legacy of struggling together for their own freedom and equality. Many of us have reason to take tremendous pride in that struggle and to participate in it. Contributing to the ongoing struggle is one way to honor their ancestors' sacrifices and to redeem their suffering. Now, it's not a mysterious fact that requires philosophical explanation why members of oppressed groups, black people, women, queer folk, the working class, colonized, and so on, generally have or try to develop in-group solidarity. Right? They face serious, enduring, systemic injustices, and so they share a practical stake in defending their common interest and in overcoming their oppression. Their common experience of oppression can produce a sense of empathy and identification. It's not surprising, then, that they are more readily disposed to trust and care for one another than outsiders. Now, this needn't be some kind of narrow interest group-based politics. It can be principled. It can be rooted in a deep sense of justice. And it can be part of a more general struggle against racism, sexism, homophobia, exploitation, or empire. I don't maintain, for example, that black people can't have solidarity with non-black people fighting for black equality or racial justice. Nor do I think that black political organizing should be racially exclusive. I simply think that there's nothing wrong with black people having a sense of in-group solidarity and that there can be politically instrumental and intrinsic value in such unity. And I would say the same thing about solidarity among the working class. When at the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels called upon the working classes of all countries to unite in the fight against capitalism, this call does not foreclose others joining their cause. The Marxist analyses of class dynamics and the relation of class to politics, of course, of great value. I say, of course, maybe you don't agree. I think of great value. Yet, I think it's evident that class position does not strictly determine a person's political commitments. Even Marx allowed that communist consciousness, while emanating primarily from the working class, quote, may of course arise among other classes too, through the contemplation of the situation of this proletarian class. Nevertheless, Marx recognized that conflicting interest and a lack of shared experience can be real impediments to solidarity. In a speech delivered in Amsterdam in 1872 at a Congress of the International Working Men's Association, Marx said, "Citizens, let us think of the basic principle of the international, solidarity. Only when we have established this life-giving principle on a sound basis among the numerous workers of all countries will we attain the great final goal which we have set ourselves." That the working class should play the key role in its own emancipation is only natural once the class can fully understand the source of its plight. As an economically exploited and politically dominated group, they have shared distinctive reasons to engage in collective resistance. Though, of course, they often fail to recognize this. No one, I think, can reasonably object to their sense of loyalty, their sense of trust, their sense of mutual concern for one another. I take it that political solidarity is typically strongest among those who not only share moral principles, but who share concrete interest. And the solidarity among the members of a union is probably the paradigm here. Black people's interest in corrective justice conflicts somewhat with other groups' interest, particularly the interest of white people. The measures needed to bring Black people to real equality inevitably are going to cost white people some things that many would rather keep: resources, opportunities, status, time, effort, and so on. This is why Blacks generally seek solidarity first and foremost among their own people. So I think it's misguided to dismiss Black solidarity as mere identity politics, as many on the right and on the left do. Often, I think, with little appreciation for the differences between various modes of group-based politics. Blacks naturally care about their social identity and their in-group community affiliation, not denying that. But when political solidarity is at issue, the term Black here really just picks out a group that is vulnerable to things like anti-Black prejudice, to discrimination, and to low status in an enduring racial hierarchy. So Blackness here functions really in much the same way that wage worker does when it picks out an exploited member of the working class. The solidarity binds together those who share a similar form of oppression, thus potentially a common cause. Many on the political left seem to think that Black solidarity discourages or it alienates non-Black people who might be willing and motivated to help advance the cause of racial justice. But frankly, I don't see that they have a good reason to be alienated. Should a man seeking to advance the cause of gender equality be alienated from women who share strong solidaristic bonds among themselves? Should an affluent lawyer or a distinguished professor who seeks to advance the cause of socialism be alienated by solidarity among the traditional working class? Don't think so. Now, I do think that political parties and social movements should be based primarily on a commitment to specific political ideals and not restricted to members of a particular oppressed group. The litmus test here should be demonstrated commitment to the political cause, not one's social identity. Nevertheless, I think the lifeblood of many political movements, including those fighting for racial or economic justice, is a solidarity among members of the relevant oppressed group. This in-group solidarity can give a movement strength and vitality. So those committed to a cause of justice should, and fortunately often do, draw on and leverage the solidarity that often exists within oppressed groups. It would be utopian, in the bad sense here, to expect broad-based solidarity in the absence of shared interest. This would be to expect too much from ethical commitment alone. Now, I don't doubt that there's going to be, as there often has been, some selfless, some self-sacrificing people who will commit to solidarity with others in a cause despite having very little, if anything, to gain personally. Such persons, they've reached a rather admirably high level of moral consciousness. They evince a strong sense of justice and impartiality, for which I think they deserve tremendous praise. But I doubt that an effective social movement can rest solely on this kind of praiseworthy moral consciousness. Many of us often need a concrete stake in the fight to live up fully to our political commitments. In the absence of a personal stake, it can be difficult to find the resolve to contribute much to the cause when faced with great adversity, such as the loss of one's job, the threat of deportation, imprisonment, or lethal violence. So to conclude, solidarity among the oppressed is not merely a matter of partisan group sentiment or cultural affinity. It is a principled, reciprocal, joint commitment grounded in mutual identification, special concern, common purpose, loyalty, and trust. It serves both as a source of political power and as a moral anchor in the struggle against injustice. For those subjected to subordination, whether this be racial, or economic, or otherwise, solidarity provides a basis for collective survival and resistance. This is why Black solidarity in particular, I think, merits affirmation rather than the criticism it so often receives. In a context where the pursuit of justice is routinely undermined by unequal power and entrenched group-based interests, solidarity among Black people, like that among workers, among women, among colonized people, and so on, is both strategically wise and, I believe, morally justified. It's not exclusionary in spirit. Such solidarity neither precludes broader coalitions, nor does it reject allies. Rather, it strengthens the foundations upon which a durable, inclusive movement can be built. Ultimately, if we hope to realize a more just society and world, we have to recognize that political solidarity cannot thrive on abstract moral commitment alone. It has to be nourished by shared stakes, by common experiences, and the bonds that form in the crucible of collective struggle. Those who suffer injustice most directly will often form the backbone of movements for liberation, not because others are unwelcome, but because I think the cause demands it. Yet, while solidarity is a powerful and necessary response to certain forms of injustice, it can also present profound challenges, I think, to leading a fulfilling life, especially for those who are oppressed. The ethical demands of solidaristic commitment can generate real tensions, not least between collective responsibility and the pursuit of personal freedom. These moral complexities, where loyalty and liberty sometimes collide, these are going to be the focus of tomorrow's lecture. And I, of course, hope to see many of you there.